Right. Recording in progress.
Really, John?
Strong disagree. Really?
We can all see you right now. We're going to get started for a minute. You're visible. Right.
In fact, I do. Yeah.
Be a spontaneous quieting of the room. I guess that's our signal. Are we ready to start over? Yeah. All right, welcome back. Make sure your audio's
Turn
off
the
on your.
this.
Oh, it's my audio. I thought it was muted. That's better. Right. Welcome back for our last session of the conference. Pardon me. I want to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Afua Bruce. Let me give a little bit. I'll keep it very short. Afua is an engineer, I love that, a professor. He has held appointments at the FBI, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He was on President Biden's transition agency review team at the DOJ. He's a public interest technologist. Public interest technologist. I love it. Civic Tech. Afua holds a degree in computer engineering from Purdue and an MBA from University of Michigan. And she is the co-author of the book, The Tech That Comes Next, which you're all going to get a copy of, mailed to you. And is how I came to know who she is. Read most of the book and found it to be insightful and interesting and right on track with what we're thinking in terms of what Cali and what legal education and technology can be in the next 40 years. All right, Afua, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the invite and the opportunity to join you today. I'm just going to take a second to bring up my slides because right now I can see myself on the big screen that's in the room and it's a little disconcerting if I'm honest. But here we go. So thank you again for the opportunity to join you all today for your conference and to wrap up what looks like has just been an incredible conference over the past day and a half or so. As has been said, my name is Afua Bruce. I'm a public interest technologist. And so what that means is I've really just spent a lot of time thinking about how to merge technology, policy, and communities together. So I have worked in the government space and with my time at the FBI and running the National Science Science and Technology Council out of the White House. I've worked in the academic space as well. I teach a course at Carnegie Mellon, or two courses at Carnegie Mellon University. I've gotten to work with nonprofits all around the world. I used to be the executive of a nonprofit that did data science and AI for nonprofit agencies all around the world. And as I look back through my career and the types of work that I'm doing, it really comes down to communities and really comes down to technology is really exciting and it matters a lot, but it especially matters and is most useful when we can make sure that the technology decisions that we're making actually resonate with communities and are meeting defined needs of communities that they are articulating. And so that's part of why I was really excited to join you for this conference today, because that's also what I see in the work that you all do, is really thinking through how can you make education and legal services available to different communities of people who need it, who have perhaps different needs, whether it's based on income or lifestyle or career goals than others. Really having a sense of what community you're serving and how you meet those needs through technology in this case. So again, thank you for having me here and just looking into your organization a little bit more and into this conference. Thanks, John. Just really want to take some time to celebrate you all in that I know this is the 40th year of CALI being around, and I think that is incredible and probably provides a moment of introspection. Anniversaries that are divisible by 10 tend to give us an opportunity, shall we say, to reflect on where we've come, but also what we can do to continue to take ourselves forward, to continue to improve, and to continue to expand our impact. And then this is the 32nd year of CaliCon, and so I'm excited that some of you can be in the room and others of you are virtual like I am as we adjust to what this new normal is in our still newest phase of the pandemic world. So just want to acknowledge the hard work that you all have been doing for decades and really the impact that you've had through the resources that you've created, through the people that have been able to be trained, and through that very real impact that you all have been able to affect. I want to start today by giving you some examples of what I mean when I say I've worked with technology and communities and what all that means. I think what I hope to convey is that it's important to, again, think about the technology that you're using and make sure it works, but really understand the needs of the community and what your ultimate end goal is. So I'll start with a case study on John Jay College, which is a 4-year institution in New York City specifically. It's part of the CUNY school system. And John Jay College has a lot of later in life learners, but also is probably one of the most diverse populations of all of the universities within the CUNY system. They're majority minority school, and a lot of their graduates go on to be in something within the field of criminal justice. John Jay College partnered with DataKind, the organization I referenced earlier that does data science for nonprofits around the world, because John Jay College realized that they had questions they wanted answers to, and the ways they'd used technology in the past, the sort of technology tools that have been brought in, could answer some questions. They just weren't the questions that John Jay College actually wanted the answers to, which in this case was, why do we have so many students who are able to complete 3/4 of the credits they need to graduate and then don't graduate? So if a student has gotten through their first year, has gotten through completing of 3/4 of the credits they need to graduate, they clearly understand how to take tests and how to schedule their time and how to build the relationships and study well. But what is preventing them from going to that next step? And so by working with the data scientist from DataKind, John Jay College began to really push into that a little bit more. The data scientists were able to take the 20 years of data that John Jay College had, being an academic institution. They were fortunate enough to be sitting on a lot of data. And the data scientists started just by doing what data scientists do, of asking different questions and running a bunch of models to figure out what are some of the key factors. The data scientist team tested, I think, about 24 models before ultimately coming up with what would be the final solution. And this algorithm that they were able to write helped to identify students who were at risk of dropping out and not completing their 4-year degrees after they'd already completed, 3/4 of the credits needed to graduate. They were able to identify different factors that were key indicators of students who would likely stop their education. And they were able to identify a number of potential interventions that then the human John Jay College staff could make the final determination about which interventions would be most useful, and then to ultimately implement those. So this was a technology system that existed, but also had a very real human interaction to it. And now, after 2 years of this algorithm being in place and this model being in place, John Jay College now credits an additional 900 students with graduating because of this algorithm and this partnership that was done between the technology, the data science in this case, and the John Jay College staff. And the additional 900 students, it was done at a cost of only about $250 per student to the university. And so when you think of the number of lives that have been changed, the number of people who are actually able to get different jobs because of their degrees, who are able to provide in different ways from their family, it's pretty impressive. And when we think back and we look back at this example, what are some of the key lessons that we can learn from it? Well, first, we were able to pick the right data for the purpose. So being an academic institution, John Jay College had the right data on hand. And then secondly, we were able to think about how technology could enable the mission of John Jay College. John Jay College's mission, of course, being to get students graduated, not just to provide them with a lot of classes, but to get them degrees and gainful employment. And then I think the final thing to note from this example is that the success isn't in the technology itself. It's not in the fact that data science worked really well. That is great. We wouldn't have this story without it. But the success is those 900 additional students who graduated, those people who were able to get the degrees and to go on and have their lives change. So again, the key point there, success is not the technology. Let me now go and give you another example that also centers technology and how organizations are able to run more effectively. And so with this, I'm going to give the example of an organization called Rescuing Leftover Cuisine, which started out in a small neighborhood in New York City. And Rescuing Leftover Cuisine, or RLC for short, has a mission, as you might imagine from the name, to rescue leftover cuisine, in which they would take leftover high quality food from restaurants and other food supply places. And then when they started out, literally have a human go pick up that food and walk it to someone who was facing food insecurity. And so this is how Rescuing Leftover Cuisine started and how they continued to operate until at some point they said, is there a better way that we could do this? Is there a way we could be more efficient? We could operate differently. And they were able to bring in a technology team and then start to design a process to manage who's got food, where is food going, who needs the food, what time is the food available, how are we getting volunteers, who's taking what routes, and the like. But this wasn't a traditional technology development, or perhaps instead of traditional, maybe an example of technology development that you might be most familiar with, where you have a technologist or company swoop in and say, have I got a solution for you, and implement it there. The technologists that Rescuing Leftover Cuisine brought in were people who really wanted to co-design both with the Rescuing Leftover Cuisine staff and their communities. And so RLC was able to create a task tracking system where people could put in their own requirements and their own requests for what should be in this new product that they were creating. And then people could sort of upvote requests and to see what new features would be most likely. And then if the decision was ultimately made to go against what was suggested or to reprioritize, that decision was made transparently and communicated to the staff, to the volunteers, to the restaurant representatives who were all in this public and open task tracking system. And after the development of this new product to help track all this information and to manage this process, Rescuing Leftover Cuisine went from one organization that was able to serve one neighborhood in New York City at that very human scale of one human walking food from one place to another, to now an organization that operates across the country, operating in 8 or 9 cities across the country on a much larger scale, in part enabled by that technology that was developed, again, in partnership with the community and in partnership with the people who would actually use it. So here, from this case study, we have some of the same lessons and some new lessons that we can take from it. The first is that it's really important to include all perspectives and users. It was crucial to rescuing leftover cuisine's success that they didn't just take the word of someone who is outside of the community, who didn't understand the ultimate goals of what they were trying to do, but they really went back to who are actual users, who are the people we're training, who are the people who are going to get the food, who are the people who are giving the food. Let's make sure we include their perspectives. The second is this idea of continuous improvement and recognizing that for leftover cuisine, their initial scale was not where they wanted to be. And so looking at building a process by which they could continue to evaluate where they were and where they could go, building in a process by which, as they even had all of those tasks and feature requests, that they could continually review those and share with people, this is what we're working on this week, this is what we'll be working on a month from now, and to continue to revisit that list and to continue to share openly. And then finally, just as with the example with John Jay College, this again is an example of how technology could really enable the mission of rescuing leftover cuisine. The results here again are that RLC is able to deliver more food to more people, taking some people off of food insecurity, which is their goal, and the technology simply enabled it. So I think you might see some parallels in some of the work that you do, your day jobs, and the work that you do through these organizations as well, as to what are you ultimately trying to affect and how are you productively using technology to get there. So with that introduction, you might imagine I am here to talk about technology. Again, I'm a public interest technologist. I'm trained as a computer engineer, and so absolutely care about the technology, but I'm also here really to talk about communities, to talk about how we can strengthen communities as we strengthen our technology, and as we can really think about what are the needs of our communities that we're working in, that we're serving, and that we want to empower. So this image that I have here is actually taken from my book, The Tech That Comes Next, and to sort of describe the general world in which we all operate for where we are today. It's kind of a world of systemic inclusion. You can see in this black and white image, it's fenced off. The control and power and access are just very siloed from each other. There are no humans here. People are sort of an afterthought in this world that we have today because the systems are so important. The power control is so important. The access control is so important. There's some technology here. Some of it is maybe a bit outdated and being used, and some of it has frankly just been discarded because it's outdated and no one's really cleaned it up or thought to repurpose it. But really that siloed effect of keeping people out rather than including, systemic exclusion, is really prevalent in sort of the society that we all live in today. But what might it look like if we did things differently? Where could we go? And I like to think that we could go to a society that's more based on systemic inclusion. So you can see here, this image now has gone from black and white to in color. There's lots of green. There are things growing. There are people growing food. The buildings that are there are around shared access and relationships and community. The through lines that you see here, people are thriving, people are collaborating, there's accountability, and there's thoughts of justice that are there. So hopefully this also resonates with the work that you do and the work that Callie is building, and really thinking through, how are we building accountability? How are we building a world of shared resources that more people can do? How are we really creating a world that can be more focused toward systemic inclusion? And in order to do that, and as you've probably heard of the importance of equity, it's become such a buzzword lately, in inclusion and diversity. And what do we mean when we say we want to create a more equitable world? What do we mean when we say we want to create a world of systemic inclusion? Well, whenever we build something, whether it's computer program, whether it's a society, or whether it's even a calendar for yourselves as you're managing your own schedules over the weekend. What we value is what we build, even if we don't talk about it. So as we think about what does it mean to create this more inclusive world, to create a world that's really centered in equity, let's talk and be really specific about what values we are creating. And so in the book, we go through 6 particular values, which I want to spend a little bit of time now just diving into a bit. And so these are, I think, the values that an equitable world really requires. So the first value is really recognizing that the knowledge and wisdom of lived experience matters. And so academics obviously matters, creating educational programs here, but really finding ways to acknowledge and incorporate lived experience and what that looks like in overall curriculum you're developing and overall programs that you're developing, recognizing that people who are parts of communities also need to be parts of the solution, and recognizing that their subject matter expertise might be the fact they live in those communities and they know how things will work or they know how things will not work. They understand the nuances of the effect of policies and regulations and community relations that are there. So really valuing the wisdom of lived experience. The second value that I think is really important when we talk about building an equitable world is about the inclusion of a diversity of people in decision-making, planning, and building technology. So as you think of the rescuing leftover cuisine example that I gave, again, that process of voting on the requirements included a lot of different people. It was a very inclusive process that had the diversity of people engaged, not just around, not just sitting at the table, but who were actively engaged, whose voices were actively heard and reacted to. And it's important here, I think, to recognize that this is true for regardless of where people are with their familiarity with technology. You don't need to be a technology expert to sit at these tables. The third value that's really important is around accessibility. And I think traditionally people talk about accessibility in terms of what modifications you might be making to websites, but it's also really important that as you think about accessibility in the work that you're doing, you think about it in all aspects. So that could be anything from what time of day are you having a meeting to meet with people in the community? Is it a time where people can actually participate? Is it done in a language where people can actually participate? And that's both a language such as English or Spanish or Japanese, but also in terms of, are you using jargon that people cannot understand? And so what does that look like? And so really thinking about accessibility a bit more broadly to allow for just the ways that people can participate in the process, as well as can then access any tool or product that you ultimately build. The fourth value that's really important is recognizing that there is a tension between making long-term systemic change in society and meeting people's needs today. So as you're designing programs, as we're thinking about building something new, really just being explicit in naming what you're doing for those longer-term visions, but also what you're doing to meet needs today. We may want to get rid of food insecurity long-term, and that might require a lot of policy changes and a lot of big picture changes, but also there are hungry people today who need to be fed. And so how are we balancing that tension? And just being explicit and working towards both ends is important. The fifth value that's incredibly important is recognizing the strength of collectively creating a vision of a better world. This means that we have to recognize that even as we're saying, what do we want this more equitable world to look like? Where are we going? That we recognize there are many people who have ideas that should be listened to, and those ideas should be incorporated in. I have this book. My co-author and I, we are not the be all end all of what an equitable world looks like. There are other people doing great work. And so let's make sure that we are collectively creating a vision of what a better world looks like. And the final value that I want to cover today is just to make sure that as we think about equity, as we think about a more equitable world, we're really thinking about the dedication of individuals and communities in pursuing knowledge. That means that you have to build in space for people to learn and to grow. And then you have to let people learn and grow. The tools that you need to succeed 5 years from now are going to be different than they are today. I mean, what we need to interact safely and in a healthy manner with people in person today, for example, is very different from what it was 5 years ago. And that's true in so many things. And so really just recognizing as you're designing programs, as you're making big plans, as you're creating things, that you need to have space for people to continue to learn, to continue to pursue knowledge, and to develop their skills. And then you need to actually let them do it and have that flexibility to evolve as the world evolves. And so now that we've talked about this basic foundation that we have, a strong foundation that we have on some 6 specific values that are included when we say we're going to design around equity, we're going to build an equitable world, how do we actually make that happen? And here, I think it's just really important to recognize that change does not happen in a silo. One of the reasons I was excited to speak to this group is because you all already bring people from different backgrounds and different roles together, which is incredibly important. And so as we think about making change and how we go from the systemic exclusion world that we're in now to a world more centered around systemic inclusion, we have to recognize we're stronger together. And so one of the organizing principles is just recognizing different roles people play and the different strengths that people bring to those roles, and that everyone, regardless of who you are, you have an important piece to play and you have an important part to carry out, and you have different powers and different levers available to you. And so in the structure of thinking through communities and technology, we've identified 5 main roles that I'll go through now, and hopefully you'll see yourself in one of them. You'll probably see yourself, frankly, in more than one role, because we exist in multiple roles at different times, and that's okay. And that is also, frankly, by design. So the first role that we've identified is social impact organizations. And these can be organizations such as nonprofit organizations, charities. They can be organizations such as mutual aid organizations. They can be associations such as Cali, and organizations that exist to really have a social impact. And so we need to think through, for social impact organizations, how do we change that culture? How do we change tech culture and investments? So the key questions that we're really looking to, I'm really encouraging social impact organizations to start to ask themselves and to start to wrestle with are, how are staff supported and resourced to align technology with your mission and your community's needs? And going even beyond staff, but how are members of your association able to do this? How are the volunteers that you're incorporating into your work able to do this work? How is technology really advancing your mission as an organization and not competing with it? How does the use of technology in your organization, how it's resourced and how it's implemented, actually help you serve your community better? And what does that tangibly look like? How does that then tie into your organization's strategy and your organization's funding plans? The second major role that we have identified is technologist. And this, being a computer engineer myself, is probably my default role that I go to often. It may be that for some of you who work on the more technical aspects of this work, but really technologists, we need to think about how we change technology development and how it can look differently than it looks today. Because as we think about technologists, and these, again, can be people like myself with a formal degree in some technology related field. It could be people who fell into technology because at their organization, when someone said, who can build a website, everyone looked around and eyes ultimately landed on you and you had to learn. And so anything in between can be a technologist. But the questions for technologists really are, how are you investing in the leadership and capacity of the impacted community to support their long-term ownership? So think back to the John Jay College example that I gave before. One of the really powerful things there is that through the process of developing the algorithms that would ultimately be used, the data scientists worked really closely with the John Jay College staff to explain what was going on, to explain how a random forest algorithm, for example, worked, and explained why the different values made the impact they had. And what this translated to is the John Jay College staff, after that engagement ended, described being more empowered to ask these questions of themselves. They now recognize that they could understand how the technology worked. And so then as other tech vendors came to campus for other things, they could ask more intelligent questions, and they could really hold other potential vendors, hold their feet to the fire to make sure that it was going to be a positive relationship, that the technology would be able to do what they actually needed to answer the questions that the John Jay College staff wanted to know, and not just a preset set of questions that the tech vendors had already come in with. And so really as technologists, thinking of how you can really use technology to empower communities and support them in supporting themselves. The next category we have is funders and investors, because even as we think about impact, even as we think about community-centered work, because we still live in a capitalistic society, money makes the world go round. And so we need to think about what power and what levers corporations, venture capitalists, philanthropic institutions, individuals who just want to donate to causes, what levers that they have to affect change. And so with funders and investors, the questions that we're asking here is, are you committed to funding inclusively for intentional engagement, iterative processes, and long-term support? So recognize that the work of building technology well takes time. It takes time to build relationships with community. It takes time to make sure people are compensated for their time. It takes time to try something out and recognize what works and what doesn't work, and try something out again, or try something out, release it, and then figure out what version 2.0 is going to look like and version 3.0 is going to look like. So the question to funders and investors is, are you really committed to inclusively funding things, and what was that going to look like? The next category of roles that I have identified here is the role of policymakers, because when it comes to making systemic change in society, which is what a lot of this work ultimately comes down to, how are we empowering people for legal resources? How are we empowering people, social impact organizations to make change? Is what do we want our society to look like that's different than it looks like today? One important lever that we have is laws and policies and regulations. And so policymakers are uniquely positioned to really have a say here. And the question for policymakers is, are you meaningfully engaging communities most impacted by digital divides and technological harm to inform proactive policies? And so I think about this in both the sense of technology for policy and policy about technology. And so how policymakers can actually use technology to do a better job of gaining input from all of the people who are working on the ground, whether they're individuals, whether they're organizations representing individuals, or something more. And then how are policymakers really thinking about policy for technology, whether that's policies around broadband access, for example, or policy about how tech companies can use technology, how they can collect data, how they can share data, how they can profit off of data or not profit off of the use of data. So really policymakers have a lot to offer here as well. And then the final role that we've identified is communities. And what I think is exciting about communities is that there's so many different types of communities, and we're all part of one, probably multiple communities. And so recognizing our role in that, but really recognizing, as we say, communities, and oftentimes in social impact organizations, as we say communities, we mean historically overlooked or underserved communities. And that's incredibly important to be specific about that and where you're working and why. But it's also incredibly important to allow the space for communities to articulate their own needs, to recognize that communities are able to define their own needs, and there may be an effort needed to translate it into technology, translate it into legal, translate it into socioeconomic or other terms for other work to be done. But community members know the needs of their community. And so let's figure out how we can use the work of communities and the knowledge of communities to drive the other pieces, to drive the policymakers, to drive the funders and investors, to drive the technologists, and to drive the social impact organizations. And so therefore the questions that we want to ask of communities is, first, what do you want to change? And two, what are your biggest dreams? Let's use these answers to then drive, again, the rest of the process as we think about how can we more productively use technology to really drive social impact, and more productively use technology to really help facilitate a more inclusive and more equitable world. So I've spent a lot of time today talking about what it means to build an equitable world. What are the values that we have, those 6 values that we have for that solid foundation? And then I spent some time talking about what are the different roles that we have, and how do you see yourself in these roles? And even more importantly, how can you start to work across these roles? That, as we think of, as I encourage you to think about where you can go from here, are the questions to ask. Is how can you really think about working across these silos in the stronger together mindset? So I think first it's important, especially for this group, to recognize that collaborations are your greatest strength. I went through these 5 individual roles and said you might see yourself in multiple of these roles, but if you don't, that's fine too. We don't ask someone who is leading a large nonprofit organization to also be an expert on funding and also be an expert on policymaking and also be an expert on technology. And so recognizing that these collaborations can really provide a lot of strength. And you just then need to develop some of the tools to be able to have conversations across these silos, conversations in ways that do recognize the learned and lived expertise of people in these different roles to really then collectively build a solution that you can use going forward. The second thing I would implore you to do is to think even more expansively about how you define community. And so think about who you today are looking at as parts of the communities of people who are using your services, of people who are consuming the resources that you're developing. And then think about how can that be expanded a little further? Are there different types of institutions that perhaps we haven't worked with so closely in the past that we may want to start working with more closely now? Or is it that we have really focused on certain types of students or certain types of learners, and we now recognize that we probably need to include into our community policymakers at some point and really think about what policies could be written to really support the work that we're doing and to advance the change that we want to see. So think even more expansively about how you define community. The third point here is to really build in from the start a plan for the end. And so for that, I mean, just provide ongoing education supplies and maintenance plans for the work that you're doing. So it is great to spend a lot of time developing a specific resource, implementing a specific program. But at some point, the people who did that development work will have to move on. They might move on to the next project or to the next resource. They might change jobs or industries. They might win the lottery and decide that they are going to go live on a beach somewhere, which honestly, as I'm looking outside my window right now, does not seem like a bad idea. But recognize that as you are designing programs, in order to really think about what can be sustainable and creating something more, that plan for providing that ongoing education for people who are consuming them, and that plan for the really thinking through who's going to continue to maintain these resources, the access to these resources and more, is incredibly important. And you can start designing with that end in mind. And then finally, I think an overarching question for you to be asking in the work that you're doing is to really ask who your work is serving and who your work is harming. And so I think oftentimes, especially as we're focused on the positive and the positive potential of the work that we're doing, the social impact good that we can have, the ability to push towards a more equitable world, we really focus on those positives and we really focus on who the work is serving. But even as you're doing great work, there are negative externalities to take into account. And so push yourselves to think about both who is the work serving and who is the work harming. Who is going to have to change the way they behave, change the way they interact based on what you're doing. And then, is that a trade-off that you want to make and should be made? Answer could be yes or no. Is that then something that you need to mitigate and have a secondary plan to figure out how to bring people along? Is that something you need to plan for significant pushback from institutions or other powers that be against the work that you're doing, just so you think that through, really think through who the work is serving and who the work is harming. Related to that question, and also encourage you to ask who has the power to turn on what you're doing and who has the power to turn off what you're doing. And so by that, I mean, if you are creating a new program, who is going to be the one to continuously say, this will continue to be able to be done. We will continue to use this program, or who has the power to say that set of information and those resources you developed, we will never use it. And so really thinking through who has the power to turn on your solutions and turn off your solutions, and really thinking intentionally about who the right messengers are and what the right points of intervention are to make sure that the solution you're developed can be turned on and left on as long as it serves, again, back to that community piece. So as long as it serves the community that you're serving. So Now that we've covered all of this, again, just want to encourage you to really think through what collaboration looks like for you, what it means to really think through the technology development that you're doing, and how it ultimately ties back to strengthening the communities which you serve, strengthening the communities with which you partner. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. We have time for questions. No questions came in from the remote folks. No questions from the room. That's perfectly all right. It's the end of a conference and people are questioning a little bit questioned out. I want to thank you for talking to us today, and I really appreciate your time.
Great, thank you so much. And congratulations on making it through a mostly in-person conference. So thank you so much.
Mouse, that one goes to that computer. All right. No, I want to save this here.